The arrival. The late afternoon sun bathed the coastal highway in shades of amber and rose as the black SUV glided effortlessly down the scenic road. The ocean stretched endlessly to their left, waves rolling onto golden sands, while lush green cliffs rose on their right, concealing the entrance to one of the most exclusive resorts in the region. Inside the car, former President Barack Obama exhaled deeply, stretching his legs as he enjoyed the cool breeze filtering through the half-open window. The weight of his years in office had lessened, but never truly disappeared. He glanced over at Michelle, who sat beside him, gazing at the picturesque landscape. "It's beautiful," she murmured, her voice laced with quiet relief. Barack chuckled. "I think this is exactly what we need." He looked forward to a vacation free of political debates, press conferences, and security briefings. A chance to be just a husband, a father, and a man enjoying a break with his wife. Michelle turned toward him with a teasing smile. "Think you can handle it? No speeches, no cameras, no strategizing." "I'll survive," he replied with a grin, "even if I have to learn to relax." The road curved, revealing the grand entrance to the Palms Resort and Spa, a Mediterranean-style sanctuary built for privacy and indulgence. Its towering palm trees swayed gently in the ocean breeze, welcoming the elite travelers who could afford such seclusion. As they pulled up to the entrance, uniformed valets rushed to the vehicle, opening doors and greeting them with well-rehearsed smiles. "Welcome to the Palms," one of them said as he extended a hand. Michelle stepped out first, inhaling the salty sea air. It was the kind of place where the world outside felt a million miles away. Barack followed, nodding politely. He didn't expect the usual fanfare here. This resort was known for its discretion. Many of its guests were powerful figures who valued privacy over publicity. As their luggage was retrieved from the car, they stepped inside the main building, where cool marble floors and an open-air atrium welcomed them. The walls were adorned with cascading greenery, while soft classical music played in the background. Behind the sleek reception desk stood a woman in a crisp beige uniform. Her hair was neatly tied in a bun, and her smile was professional, until her eyes landed on them. The pause was subtle but unmistakable. She faltered, just for a moment, before recovering. "Good evening," she said smoothly, though her smile no longer reached her eyes. "Welcome to the Palms Resort. May I have your name, please?" Barack handed over the reservation details. Obama, Barack, and Michelle. The receptionist nodded, but a quick glance passed between her and her colleague. It was a silent exchange, one that Michelle had seen before. A flicker of something. Surprise, hesitation, calculation. One of the other employees subtly turned their back, whispering into a small earpiece. Michelle, always quick to read a room, felt the shift. Something was off. "Ah, yes," the receptionist said, forcing another smile. "We have your reservation. Just one moment." She tapped away at her keyboard, taking longer than necessary. Michelle's eyes flickered toward the guest next to them. An older couple who received their key cards almost immediately. Minutes passed. Then the receptionist sighed dramatically, putting on her most apologetic face. "I'm terribly sorry," she said. "There's been a mix-up with the reservations. Unfortunately, the Ocean View suite you booked is currently unavailable." A tight knot formed in Michelle's stomach. She exchanged a glance with Barack, who raised an eyebrow. "That's strange," Barack said, maintaining his usual calm. "We booked well in advance." "Yes, of course," the woman said quickly, "but there was an oversight in our system. The best we can do at the moment is place you in one of our Garden View suites." Michelle's lips pressed together. She had spent months planning this getaway, making sure every detail was perfect. "The Garden View suite," she echoed. "That's not what we booked." The receptionist feigned sympathy. "We sincerely apologize. Our manager will personally see to it that you're moved as soon as something opens up." Barack gave Michelle a small look, one that said, "Let's pick our battles." "All right," he said with a patient nod. "We'll take it for now." A bellboy appeared, collecting their luggage and leading them through the elegant hallways. The corridors were wide and polished, adorned with paintings of serene beaches and sun-kissed landscapes. As they reached their suite, the door was unlocked with a quiet beep. The room was tastefully decorated with soft lighting, a plush king-sized bed, and a cozy sitting area. Yet the promised ocean view was nowhere to be seen. Instead, their windows overlooked a modest courtyard with trimmed hedges and a stone fountain. Michelle set her purse down, exhaling sharply. You know what this feels like. Barack walked over to the window, his hands in his pockets. I do, he admitted. She sat on the edge of the bed, shaking her head. It's not just an oversight. They saw us, and suddenly, our reservation was mixed up. Barack leaned against the wall, his expression thoughtful. Let's not jump to conclusions yet. Maybe it's an honest mistake. Michelle knew better. She had experienced these subtle moments her whole life, the almost imperceptible shifts in energy, the way people adjusted their tone when they realized who they were dealing with. Yet, she also knew that if they pressed too soon, it could be spun into misunderstanding or coincidence. Fine, she relented, standing up. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt, but I'm paying attention. That evening, they decided to explore the resort. The Palms was breathtaking. Winding stone paths led to private bungalows, infinity pools stretched toward the horizon, and candlelit tables were set up along the beachfront for an intimate dining experience. But as they walked through the grounds, Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Other guests glanced at them, some subtly, some openly. Conversations hushed as they passed. It wasn't hostility, necessarily, but there was an undeniable shift in atmosphere. At dinner, they were seated near the back of the restaurant, despite the empty tables near the front. The waiter took his time reaching them, fumbling with their order while attending other guests with ease. When their food finally arrived, it was lukewarm. Michelle took a deep breath, setting her fork down. Barack. I know, he said, his voice steady. We're being treated differently. He reached for her hand across the table, his grip reassuring. We'll see how tomorrow goes. But Michelle already knew. Tomorrow would only bring more of the same, and if they thought she was the type to sit quietly and accept it, they were sorely mistaken. This wasn't over. The tension grows. The next morning, Michelle woke up to the golden sunlight filtering through the sheer curtains, but instead of feeling refreshed, there was a lingering unease in her chest. The events of the previous evening played over in her mind. The delayed check-in, the quiet but clear shift in how they were treated, the hushed whispers that followed them around the resort. She wasn't the type to overanalyze every interaction, but she had spent too many years recognizing these subtle forms of discrimination to ignore them now. Barack sat by the small writing desk near the window, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand, flipping through his phone as he read the morning news. His expression was calm, but Michelle knew him well enough to recognize the crease between his brows, a telltale sign that he was deep in thought. She stretched slightly before getting up, patting across the soft carpet toward him. Good morning, she said, resting her hand on his shoulder. He looked up and gave her a small smile. Morning. How'd you sleep? Michelle shrugged as she took a seat across from him. Could have been better. You? He let out a small chuckle. Same. He took a sip of his coffee before setting the cup down. I think we need to give today a fair chance. Maybe yesterday was just an off day. Michelle folded her arms, watching him carefully. Barack, I know what you're trying to do, and I get it, but you felt it too. He sighed, rubbing his hand along his jaw before nodding. Yeah, I did. But I also know that making a scene too early doesn't always work in our favor. Let's just see how today unfolds. We keep our eyes open, but we don't assume the worst. Yet. Michelle nodded, though her gut told her that yesterday had been no coincidence. Still, she agreed to play along. For now. They got dressed and headed to breakfast at the resort's terrace restaurant, a stunning open-air space with panoramic views of the turquoise ocean. The morning sun bathed everything in warmth, and a soft breeze carried the salty scent of the sea. Other guests were already seated at tables adorned with white linens, sipping fresh juices and chatting leisurely. A pianist played soft jazz in the background, adding to the luxurious atmosphere. They found a table near the railing, hoping for a quiet meal with a beautiful view. A waiter approached soon after, a tall, wiry man in his late 20s with a nervous demeanor. He avoided eye contact as he handed them menus, his fingers trembling slightly. "I'll be back shortly to take your order," he mumbled before hurrying away. Michelle frowned, watching him weave between tables with quick, anxious steps. Other waiters moved with confidence, chatting casually with guests, yet their server seemed almost afraid to be seen speaking to them. They placed their order when he returned: fresh fruit, eggs, toast, and coffee for Barak, while Michelle opted for avocado toast with smoked salmon. The waiter scribbled down their request quickly before darting off. Minutes passed, then 15, then 20. Other guests who had arrived after them were already being served, their tables adorned with steaming plates of food. The waiter attending to a table nearby laughed along with the guests, refilling their coffee cups with ease. Michelle's gaze flickered toward their own waiter, who had yet to return with so much as a glass of water. Her patience was beginning to wane. She hated feeling like a nuisance, but she wasn't about to sit back and accept being overlooked. She caught the attention of a passing hostess. "Excuse me," she said, keeping her voice polite but firm. "We've been waiting a while for our order. Could you check on it for us?" The hostess blinked, as if surprised she was being spoken to. "Oh, of course. Let me see what's going on." She walked toward the kitchen, disappearing behind the double doors. Michelle turned back to Barak, who exhaled deeply. "Looks like we're on round 2, he murmured. "Seems that way," she muttered. A few minutes later, their waiter reappeared, balancing a tray with their meals. He set the plates down carefully, his hand shaking just enough for Michelle to notice. "Sorry for the delay," he muttered. Michelle studied him carefully. "Everything all right?" He swallowed visibly. "Yes, Mom." He didn't wait for another word before retreating, disappearing into the restaurant. Michelle exchanged a look with Barak. The discomfort on the waiter's face wasn't just nerves, it was something else. "I think he's scared," Michelle said in a low voice. Barak nodded slowly. "And I think we're missing a bigger piece of this puzzle." They finished breakfast in relative silence, both lost in thought. As they made their way back to their room to grab a few things before heading to the beach, Michelle took note of the way other guests interacted with the staff. The wealthier, more obviously privileged guests received warm smiles and effortless service. Staff members fawned over them, ensuring they had everything they needed. But when it came to employees of color, or guests like Michelle and Barak, the energy was different. Not openly hostile, but guarded, calculated. It wasn't just about them. There was something deeper going on here. Later that afternoon, they decided to take advantage of the resort's private beach. It was one of the main reasons they had chosen this place: pristine white sands, crystal clear waters, and the promise of seclusion. They arrived at the beach club, where rows of shaded loungers were set up for guests. Michelle approached the attendant, a middle-aged man wearing a polo shirt with the resort's emblem embroidered on the chest. "Hi, we have a reservation for a pair of loungers," she said, giving him her name. The man barely glanced at her before shaking his head. "I'm sorry, but all the reserved loungers are taken." Michelle blinked. "That's strange. We specifically reserved ours when we booked." The attendant shrugged, shifting on his feet. "I understand, but once guests settle in, we don't ask them to move. You're welcome to wait and see if something opens up." Michelle inhaled sharply, her patience growing thin. "I see." She stepped back, glancing at Barak. They didn't even check the list. Barak sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I noticed." A couple strolled past them toward the attendant, and Michelle watched as they simply gave their name and were immediately escorted to 2 vacant loungers near the water. She turned back to Barak. "That's it. I'm done playing nice." He chuckled, though there was little humor in it. "I was wondering when you'd hit your limit." Michelle squared her shoulders, her expression hardening. If they think they can quietly brush us aside, they're in for a rude awakening. She took a step forward, but before she could confront the attendant, a soft voice called her name. "Mrs. Obama." She turned to see a young woman standing a few feet away, her uniform crisp, but her eyes filled with something that looked like nervousness. "My name is Lucia," she said quickly, glancing over her shoulder. I work here, and I think there's something you need to know." Michelle narrowed her eyes slightly, exchanging a glance with Barak. "Go on," she said. Lucia hesitated, lowering her voice. "They don't want you here. They don't want people like you here. And they'll do whatever it takes to make you uncomfortable enough to leave." Michelle felt a chill race down her spine. She had suspected it. Now, she had proof. And she was about to make sure everyone else knew too. The hidden truth begins to unravel. Michelle took a deep breath, steadying herself as she studied the young woman standing before her. Lucia's dark eyes flickered with something between nervousness and urgency, and her hands fidgeted slightly, as if she wasn't sure whether she should have spoken at all. Michelle exchanged a quick glance with Barak, who nodded subtly. They had both spent their lives navigating situations like this, moments where the truth hid beneath layers of practiced politeness and quiet prejudice. But now, the truth was finally speaking for itself. Lucia's words lingered in Michelle's mind. "They don't want people like you here. They'll do whatever it takes to make you uncomfortable enough to leave." For a long moment, Michelle simply held Lucia's gaze, searching for more than just the fear in her expression. There was something deeper there, something personal. This wasn't just about them. It was about her too. Michelle's voice was calm but firm when she spoke. "How long have you worked here, Lucia?" Lucia glanced over her shoulder again before answering, lowering her voice. 3 years. I started as a housekeeper, but I've been working in guest services for the past year." Barak folded his arms across his chest, his expression unreadable. "And you're telling us that this," he gestured vaguely around the beach club, "is intentional, not just bad service or incompetence." Lucia's throat bobbed as she swallowed. She hesitated, then nodded. "It's always been like this. There are rules that aren't written down, but everyone knows them. Certain guests, wealthy, powerful, white guests, get everything without question. People like me and people like you are treated differently. Sometimes it's small things, but it adds up." Michelle narrowed her eyes slightly. "Tell me about the rules." Lucia took a deep breath, as if weighing the risk of what she was about to say. "They make it hard for people they don't want here. They do things like delaying reservations, giving smaller rooms, accidentally overbooking things like cabanas, private dinners, even spa appointments. The higher-ups make sure that certain guests feel uncomfortable enough that they don't come back. And if someone speaks up, they make it seem like an isolated incident, a misunderstanding." Michelle felt a cold anger settle in her stomach. Barak nodded slowly. "And you're telling us this. Why?" Lucia hesitated, then lifted her chin. "Because I'm tired of it. I'm tired of watching good people get treated like they don't belong. And because," she hesitated, looking down, "because I know I'll probably lose my job for telling you this. But I don't care anymore." Michelle's chest tightened. She reached out and gently touched Lucia's hand. "You're brave for speaking up." Lucia gave a small, humorless laugh. "No, I'm just tired of being afraid." A heavy silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the sound of waves rolling onto the shore. Michelle and Barak had seen discrimination take many forms over the years, some blatant, some insidious. This was the latter, the kind that could be denied with carefully worded press statements and performative apologies. But now, they had proof. And Michelle had never been the kind of person to let things slide. She turned back to Lucia. "If you're willing to talk, I want to hear everything, no matter how small it seems, because this isn't just about us. This is about every person who has been pushed out of places like this, and every employee who has been forced to go along with it." Lucia hesitated again, her fingers twisting the hem of her apron. Then she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll tell you everything." The web of discrimination. They left the beach, heading toward a quieter part of the resort, where they could talk without fear of being overheard. Lucia led them to a shaded patio area near the gardens, where guests rarely lingered. She pulled out her phone, glancing at the time as if she were already anticipating trouble. "I have to be quick," she murmured. "They monitor us, but there's a pattern to everything they do." She took a deep breath before launching into her explanation. "The Palms is owned by a private investment group that doesn't like bad publicity, but they have an image they want to keep. They cater to a certain kind of guest, the ultra-rich, the old money, the politicians and CEOs who expect a certain level of exclusivity. And that means keeping people who don't fit out." Barak's jaw tightened. "So, they go out of their way to make sure people like us don't come back." Lucia nodded. "Yes, and it's not just you. I've seen them do it to other black guests, Latino families, even Middle Eastern visitors who don't look the part. They do just enough to make people feel unwelcome. But they never make it obvious. It's always subtle, always deniable." Michelle clenched her fists. "And the staff?" Lucia exhaled. "Most of us are treated like we don't matter. The higher-ups look at people like me as disposable. If I mess up, even once, I'm replaced. But if one of the senior staff makes a mistake, they're protected. They never get fired, just quietly reassigned. And the worst part, they make us enforce their rules." Michelle frowned. "What do you mean?" Lucia's voice turned bitter. "They tell us how to treat certain guests, which tables to seat them at, which rooms to give them, which requests to accidentally forget. If someone pushes back, we're the ones who take the blame. We're the ones who get yelled at or punished, not the people in charge." Barak rubbed his forehead. "This is systemic. It's built into the way this place operates." Lucia nodded. "It's been like this for years. But most guests never notice, because it's designed to be invisible to the right people." Michelle inhaled deeply, trying to steady the anger simmering inside her. She had spent her entire life fighting against systems like this, against people who thought they could decide who belonged and who didn't. She wasn't about to let this slide. She turned to Barak. "We can't let them get away with this." His eyes darkened slightly. "No, we can't." Lucia glanced around, suddenly looking nervous. "I should go. If they see me talking to you for too long, they'll ask questions." Michelle reached into her purse, pulling out a small card and pressing it into Lucia's hand. "If anything happens, call me. No matter what. You're not alone in this." Lucia nodded quickly, then turned and disappeared down the path, leaving Michelle and Barak standing in silence. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Barak let out a slow breath. "So," he said, voice calm but firm, "how do we handle this?" Michelle's expression hardened with determination. "We do what we do best," she said. "We tell the truth." She pulled out her phone, scrolling through her contacts. If the Palms thought they could brush them aside, they were about to learn the hard way that Michelle and Barack Obama were not the kind of people who let injustice go unanswered. The fight had only just begun. The fire beneath the surface. Michelle felt the familiar fire burn in her chest as she and Barak walked back toward their suite. The warm coastal breeze should have been soothing, but instead, it carried the weight of everything she had just heard from Lucia. It wasn't just them. It was every guest who had been made to feel less than, every staff member forced to uphold rules designed to push certain people away, every quiet moment of exclusion hidden beneath a veil of politeness. She had fought battles like this before, in the White House, in boardrooms, in media interviews where coded words were used to imply she was out of place. She had learned to read between the lines, to recognize when racism was dressed up as policy or standards or tradition. And here, at the Palms Resort, it was all of those things woven into an invisible system meant to keep people like her and Barak on the fringes. Inside their suite, Barak locked the door behind them and walked straight to the minibar, pouring himself a glass of water. He took a slow sip before turning to Michelle, his expression thoughtful but serious. "So," he said, leaning against the counter, "how do we want to play this?" Michelle crossed her arms, pacing slightly. "We expose them. Plain and simple." Barak nodded but remained quiet for a moment, thinking. He had always been strategic, always looking 5 steps ahead before making a move. Michelle knew he agreed with her, but she also knew he was weighing the risks. "This is going to get ugly," he finally said. "Once we push this into the spotlight, they're going to do everything they can to make us look like the ones causing the problem." Michelle huffed out a laugh, shaking her head. "They already think we're the problem." He sighed, running a hand over his jaw. "True." She stopped pacing and faced him. "What are you worried about?" Barak set his glass down. "I just want to make sure we do this in a way that actually forces change. If we go public too soon, they'll brush it off as a misunderstanding. If we wait too long, they'll have time to cover their tracks." Michelle exhaled slowly, considering his words. He was right. They needed more. More voices, more proof, more leverage. She grabbed her phone from the nightstand and scrolled through her contacts. "I think it's time we bring in the right people." Barak watched as she typed out a message. "Who are you calling?" She gave him a small smirk. "A journalist. A good one." The power of truth. It didn't take long for Michelle's message to be answered. Within the hour, she was on a secure video call with a reporter she trusted, Naomi Pierce, a hard-hitting investigative journalist known for exposing corporate corruption and discrimination in the hospitality industry. She was young but relentless, the kind of journalist who dug deep and didn't back down. The screen flickered, and Naomi's face appeared, her sharp green eyes narrowing slightly as she leaned forward. "Michelle," she said, adjusting her earpiece, "I didn't expect a call from you while you were on vacation." Michelle gave her a wry smile. "Trust me, neither did I." Naomi arched a brow. "But I'm guessing this isn't just a friendly check-in." "No," Michelle said, her expression hardening. "It's something much bigger." She took a deep breath and launched into the story. Everything from the moment they arrived. The reservation mix-up, the subtle but deliberate ways they were treated differently, and most importantly, the conversation with Lucia. Naomi listened intently, nodding occasionally but not interrupting. When Michelle finally finished, the journalist leaned back in her chair, exhaling through her nose. "Damn," she muttered. "I can't say I'm surprised, but that doesn't make it any less disgusting." Barak, who had been standing just off-screen, stepped forward. "We need to make sure they can't spin this," he said. "If we go public, they'll deny everything. Say it was a one-time mistake. Maybe fire a couple of employees to make it look like they're handling it." Naomi nodded. "Exactly. If we do this, we need airtight evidence. Not just your word, but the voices of others. Staff members, guests, former employees. People who have seen this happen over and over." Michelle glanced at Barak. "Lucia is a start." Naomi frowned slightly. "She'll need protection. If she talks, they'll fire her." Michelle's jaw tightened. "I know, but she's ready." Naomi tapped her pen against her notepad, thinking, "Okay, here's what we do. I'll send a few of my researchers to quietly dig into the Palms, past lawsuits, employee complaints, anything that hints at a pattern. Meanwhile, you talk to Lucia again. If she's willing to go on record, we'll need to be careful about how we frame it. And if we can get others to come forward, even better." Michelle nodded. "I'll handle it." Naomi's gaze flickered between them. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Barak exhaled through his nose. If we don't, who will? The journalist gave them a small, approving smile. All right then. Let's burn it down. The cracks in the foundation. Over the next day, Michelle and Barak worked behind the scenes, quietly gathering information. They spoke with Lucia again, who was nervous but determined to tell the truth. They also managed to discreetly talk to a few other employees, kitchen staff, a receptionist, even a groundskeeper, who all shared similar experiences of being treated as second class. Barak kept notes on everything, documenting each account with precise details. Michelle reached out to a few guests she had noticed getting similar treatment, subtly asking if they had experienced anything unusual. Some were hesitant to talk, but others admitted that they had noticed the same patterns. Meanwhile, Naomi's team uncovered a trail of complaints that had been buried. Former employees who had quietly left after experiencing mistreatment, guests who had left negative reviews but never got a response, even an old lawsuit from a black couple who had sued the Palms for racial discrimination years ago. The case had been settled quietly, but the story was still there, waiting to be unearthed. By the second night, Michelle and Barak sat in their suite, their notes spread across the table, their phones buzzing with updates from Naomi's team. Michelle leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. This isn't just one resort. It's bigger than that. Barak nodded. It always is. Michelle exhaled. So what's our next move? Barak tapped his fingers against the table, then looked at her. We go public. Michelle met his gaze. Tonight. He nodded. Tonight. She picked up her phone and drafted a statement. It wasn't a long one, just enough to ignite the conversation. Discrimination isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. It hides behind fake smiles, subtle exclusions, and unwritten rules. But just because you can't see it doesn't mean it isn't there. And when it's exposed, the people who built it scramble to cover their tracks. We see it. We feel it. And we're not staying silent. More to come. She hit send. Barak watched as the notification popped up on the screen, then reached for her hand. Here we go. Within minutes, the internet exploded. The world was watching now. And the Palms Resort was about to learn that they had messed with the wrong people. The storm breaks. The moment Michelle hit send, she knew there was no turning back. It wasn't just a social media post. It was a direct challenge, a spark thrown into a room filled with dry kindling. Within minutes, comments flooded in, some supportive, some skeptical, and others outright defensive. The post was shared thousands of times within the hour, with news outlets picking it up almost immediately. Michelle sat back, watching the waves of reactions unfold. Barak stood near the window, arms crossed, his expression unreadable as he watched the glow of the resort lights against the darkening sky. The floodgates are open, he murmured. Michelle exhaled sharply. Good. Let's see how they handle it. They didn't have to wait long. Less than an hour later, Michelle's phone buzzed with a call from Naomi. She answered immediately. You just put a match to a gasoline-soaked building, Naomi said without preamble. I've already got 3 networks reaching out to me for a statement. The Palms is scrambling. Michelle felt a cold satisfaction settle in her chest. Good. What's their move? They put out a generic press statement about being committed to inclusivity and taking concerns seriously. It's the usual corporate nonsense. No specifics, no ownership, just enough words to make it look like they're doing something while actually saying nothing. Michelle rolled her eyes. Predictable. Naomi's voice grew more serious. But here's where it gets interesting. I have sources inside the Palms. The higher-ups are panicking. They were hoping your complaint would fade. But now that it's public, they don't know how to contain it. They've already scheduled an emergency meeting with their legal team. Barak turned toward Michelle, catching the change in her expression. They're getting scared, she said, putting the call on speaker so he could hear. Naomi continued. And here's the real kicker. Employees are starting to talk. Your post gave them the push they needed. I've already received messages from 3 current employees and 2 former ones. They have receipts, emails, recordings, and internal documents proving the Palms has had a pattern of discrimination for years. This isn't just a PR problem for them anymore. This could turn into a lawsuit. Michelle leaned forward, her heartbeat quickening. Do you trust your sources? Absolutely, Naomi said. But they're scared. They've seen what happens when people speak out. Some of them have already been threatened with termination. Michelle clenched her jaw. That's exactly why we have to keep pushing. They want to silence this. We make it so loud they can't. Barack, ever the strategist, spoke up. We need to make sure we don't just throw accusations. We need this to be airtight. The moment we go on record, they're going to come after us with everything they have. Naomi chuckled dryly. Oh, they're already working on that. I have it on good authority that their PR team is preparing a counter-narrative. Expect claims that you misunderstood the situation, that the staff was simply overwhelmed, that the mix-up with your reservation was a minor clerical error. Michelle scoffed. Of course. The classic "you're overreacting" defense. Exactly, Naomi said. They want to make this look like an unfortunate miscommunication, rather than a systemic issue. Barack nodded thoughtfully. So, we don't just tell the story. We show the evidence. Naomi hummed in agreement. And that's where my team comes in. We're going to publish a report compiling everything. The internal complaints, the guest experiences, the employee testimonies. If the Palms wants to play the denial game, we'll bury them in facts. Michelle felt the first stirrings of victory. When do you go public? Naomi's voice sharpened. Tomorrow morning. Barack and Michelle exchanged glances. That was fast. Naomi continued. They have money, but we have the truth. And trust me, once this goes live, they're going to wish they had handled this differently. Michelle's lips curled into a determined smile. Then let's make sure they regret it. The first signs of collapse. The next morning, Michelle and Barack woke early, their phones already buzzing with notifications before the sun had fully risen. Naomi's article had dropped. The headline was brutal. Exposed. Luxury Resorts' Hidden Culture of Discrimination and Suppression. Michelle clicked on the link, scanning the article quickly. It was thorough. Naomi had done her homework. The piece laid out a damning history of racial discrimination at the Palms, backed up by documented complaints, anonymous staff testimonies, and evidence of internal policies that encouraged quiet exclusion. It even included screenshots of internal emails where managers instructed staff to politely dissuade certain guests from returning. Barack read over her shoulder, his expression growing graver with each paragraph. This is bad for them. Michelle smirked. Good. The public response was swift and merciless. Within hours, #BoycottThePalms was trending. Celebrities, activists, and public figures weighed in, some sharing their own stories of discrimination at luxury establishments. The Palms' social media pages were flooded with angry comments. Their latest Instagram post, a generic photo of a sunset over the ocean, was drowning in demands for accountability. By noon, the resort had released another statement. This time, the tone had changed. We acknowledge that concerns have been raised, and we are committed to thoroughly investigating the claims made. We take matters of inclusivity seriously, and will be conducting a comprehensive internal review. Michelle rolled her eyes as she read it aloud. Translation: We got caught, and now we're scrambling to cover our asses. Barack chuckled, though there was no humor in it. It's only the beginning. Now they have to decide, do they actually change, or do they double down? An hour later, the answer became clear. A leaked email surfaced, this time from the Palms' own management. It was a desperate internal memo sent to staff, warning them not to speak to the press and instructing them to remain professional in the face of misinformation. The email also hinted that any employees caught engaging in unauthorized discussions would face consequences. Michelle saw it trending before she even had time to process it. The backlash was immediate. What had started as a scandal was turning into a full-blown crisis. By late afternoon, Naomi called again. "They're losing control," she said, the excitement evident in her voice. "Investors are getting nervous. I just got word that at least one major stakeholder is considering pulling out. They're trying to contain the fallout, but it's slipping through their fingers." Michelle let out a slow breath. "Good. But we're not done yet." Barak nodded in agreement. "This can't just end with a couple of firings and a PR campaign. If we're going to do this, we push until real change happens." Naomi agreed. "Then let's turn up the heat." Michelle clicked her phone off and turned to Barak. "We go bigger. Public interviews. Maybe even a live discussion." Barak nodded. "We make sure this doesn't fade." Michelle exhaled. This fight was bigger than them now, but they weren't going to let up. They had set the fire. Now they were going to make sure it burned. The reckoning. The following morning, Michelle woke before sunrise. The room was silent except for the rhythmic crashing of waves in the distance. She lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling, her mind already racing through the events of the past few days. The Palms Resort was in full damage control, but the truth had already cracked its pristine image, and the fissures were widening by the hour. She turned her head to find Barak already awake, sitting at the small writing desk, tapping away on his laptop. His brows were furrowed in concentration, the glow from the screen casting sharp shadows across his face. "You've been up for a while," Michelle murmured, sitting up and stretching. Barak looked over his shoulder and gave her a small smile. "Couldn't sleep. Too much happening." He gestured toward the screen. Naomi sent over another update. "Investors are pulling out. One of their biggest clients, a Fortune 500 CEO, just announced he's canceling his future stays at the Palms." Michelle smirked. "Now that's what I like to hear." Barak chuckled. "It gets better. There are whispers that the board is considering forcing the general manager to step down. But they're still trying to decide how much damage control they're willing to do before they admit they're drowning." Michelle swung her legs over the edge of the bed. "They're hoping this dies down, that people will get distracted and move on." She shook her head. "They don't realize we're just getting started." She picked up her phone and checked her messages. Naomi had sent a text. "CNN and MSNBC want a live interview. New York Times is asking for an exclusive. The Palms is circling their lawyers. We have them on the ropes." Michelle exhaled, gripping her phone tighter. "They're scared." Barak stood up, rolling his shoulders, as they should be. The turning point. Later that afternoon, Michelle and Barak sat in front of a camera for a live interview with CNN. They had chosen the setting carefully, the balcony of their suite, with the ocean stretching behind them. They wanted to make one thing clear: they weren't hiding. The interviewer, a seasoned journalist named David Langston, leaned forward, his expression serious. "Mr. and Mrs. Obama, your statements have sparked a massive discussion about discrimination in luxury spaces. The Palms Resort is now facing investor withdrawals, public backlash, and potential legal action. Some have called your experience an isolated incident, while others believe it's part of a larger pattern of exclusion that happens in high-end hospitality. What do you say to those who claim you're making this a bigger issue than it is?" Michelle leaned in slightly, her voice measured but firm. "Discrimination doesn't always look like someone shouting slurs or denying you entry outright. Sometimes it's subtle. It's a mistake with your reservation. It's a table in the back when there are plenty of open seats at the front. It's being served last when others who arrived after you are being treated like VIPs. And it's not just us. This is something that has been happening to people of color, working-class guests, and employees in these places for years." Barak nodded, picking up where she left off. "The Palms is not unique. What we experienced is a symptom of a much larger issue in the hospitality industry. There's an unspoken system that quietly pushes certain people to the margins while catering to a specific type of guest. That system thrives on silence. We're just refusing to stay silent." David's expression shifted. the weight of their words settling in. Some critics have accused you of overreacting, claiming that the Palms has always been known for exclusivity, not discrimination. How do you respond to that? Michelle's eyes sharpened. Exclusivity is not an excuse for racism. You can run a luxury resort without creating a culture that makes people feel unwelcome based on their race, their background, or their status. The problem isn't exclusivity, it's who is being systematically excluded. Barack added, and let's be clear, this isn't just about personal discomfort. This is about a pattern of behavior that affects people's livelihoods. Employees of the Palms have come forward with stories of mistreatment, racial bias, and unfair treatment. That's not exclusivity. That's discrimination. David nodded. So what happens next? Michelle's expression hardened. Accountability. Barack leaned forward, his voice unwavering. The Palms doesn't get to sweep this under the rug. We expect to see real changes, policy changes, hiring practices, diversity training that actually means something. And we expect to see protection for employees like Lucia, who risked their jobs to speak the truth. David hesitated before asking his final question. If the Palms refuses to make meaningful changes, what will you do? Michelle's response was immediate. Then we make sure everyone knows exactly who they are. The interview ended, and within minutes, it was trending worldwide. The collapse of a giant. The next 48 hours were chaos for the Palms Resort. The interview had been the final blow, and the fallout was swift. By the end of the second day, the general manager had resigned. The board of directors released a desperate statement announcing a complete overhaul of the Palms' diversity and inclusion policies. They promised an internal investigation, the termination of any employees involved in discriminatory practices, and a commitment to making the resort a welcoming environment for all guests. But Michelle wasn't satisfied. She reached out to advocacy groups, pushing for transparency. She worked with Naomi to ensure that the former employees who had come forward were protected. She called for legislation that would hold luxury establishments accountable for discriminatory practices. And the public didn't let up. Guests canceled their reservations in droves. Travel influencers denounced the resort. Major corporations withdrew their partnerships. The Palms went from being one of the most sought-after destinations to a symbol of elitist racism. By the end of the week, the Palms' parent company had lost millions in revenue. By the end of the month, the CEO stepped down. And by the end of the year, the Palms was forced to shut down temporarily for a full restructuring. The aftermath. Michelle and Barack sat on their porch back home in Washington. The cool night air, a welcome contrast to the heat of the past few weeks. The fight had been exhausting, but worth it. Michelle sipped her tea, scrolling through her phone. Lucia had sent her a message. Thank you. Not just for me, but for everyone who has been ignored for too long. I found a new job, one where I'm actually respected. Because of you, I don't have to be afraid anymore. Michelle smiled, showing the message to Barack. He read it, then leaned back in his chair. That, he said, makes it all worth it. She exhaled, letting the tension finally leave her body. We won't fix everything overnight, but at least now, they know they can't get away with it. Barack nodded, his eyes thoughtful. And maybe next time, when someone else speaks up, they won't have to fight as hard to be heard. Michelle reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers. The battle wasn't over, but this victory was theirs. And it was just the beginning.